Hello there friends, welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan, and it's more than just a ship, bro. Every Star Wars adventure is slightly different, but a great Star Wars adventure usually starts with a ship of some kind. That's because in a galaxy full of planets and moons to visit without a starship, suddenly you're looking at a story that becomes planet-bound, which makes it a lot smaller and less grand. Which is really the last thing that George Lucas would have wanted. You see, before George found a natural ability and love for cinema and storytelling, he was a car guy. In high school, he spent most of his free time racing in underground circuits and tuning his car in garages. American Graffiti, Lucas's first non-indie film, was exactly about that lifestyle. And get this, in the early 1960s, when everyone else was driving a Chevy Impala, Lucas's dad bought him a tiny, yellow Auto Bianchi Bianchina. If you guys have seen a Fiat 500, it's based off the original classic Fiat 500. The thing had like a 2-cylinder, 479cc motorcycle engine in it, and well, I guess George Lucas's dad thought that George would be safer if he drove this tiny, very slow car. But have you guys seen Rebel Alliance starfighters? You know, the Clone Wars era Y-Wings with the engine nacelles removed. Or what about the A-Wing, where the pilots removed the deflector shields to give themselves just a bit more energy for the engines? Well, that's exactly what George Lucas's idea of fun is, and somehow he managed to turn his tiny little Italian car into a decent racer. And he began to run it in all sorts of races until this happened. Lucas was T-boned by a much larger Chevy Impala. Luckily, his racing belt broke during the impact, and that threw him free of his vehicle, which ended up smacking into a walnut tree. George Lucas was technically dead for a little bit, actually. He had shattered basically all the bones in his body. He had a lot of internal damage. I think he punctured a lung. This, along with being drafted into the Vietnam War and then being excused because he had diabetes, is the main reason why we now have Star Wars. And at the core of the original Star Wars film was a young boy that in a lot of ways probably represents a younger George Lucas. You know, Luke Skywalker. Like George, Luke enjoyed tinkering around with airspeeders and flying through canyons targeting womp rats. But Luke's fascination with machines and going fast really was rooted in a deeper desire that George Lucas shared growing up in a very modest suburb of Modesto, California. And that was a desire to leave home and step out into the world and experience your own adventure. And so the automobile for him, for many Americans, including myself, is a symbol of freedom. It's really the first time in your life that you can go anywhere you want without your parents. And while you're on your wild adventure, your car, your bike, your spaceship represents a little piece of familiarity in a new, strange place. And actually, aside from racing cars and making films, Lucas had one other passion in life, and that is anthropology, or the study of humanity. Lucas recognized and respected the role that religion played in guiding human civilization. He also understood how important it is for a society to have shared values and beliefs. But growing up in the 1960s and witnessing the counterculture that was vehemently anti-religion, Lucas started playing around with this idea of a modern myth, a story that had a lot of the same values and ethics and morality that religion might have, religious stories might have, but you just don't have the baggage of religion tied to it. And so with Star Wars, George Lucas was really trying to create some shared values for the viewing audience. There's actually this interview, which I can't find, where Lucas talks about Luke's journey from Tatooine and how it was really designed to inspire children to be courageous and to go out there on their own and start living their own adventures and becoming adults. And in order to really ingrain these myths, these stories into the viewers' heads, well, what Lucas did was just create repetition.
And instead of destroying the Death Star, he destroys the ship that controls the robots. Again, it's like poetry, so if they rhyme.
And when Disney took over, they fully embraced this idea of rhyming or poetry. I mean, The Force Awakens from a plot point of view is very similar to The New Hope. You have a young nobody living in the middle of nowhere who has no idea how powerful they are. You have a fascist military force arriving looking for a droid that has plans or a map. That young nobody ends up leaving the planet and somehow ends up joining a rebel movement against that fascist organization we just talked about. They even have a Death Star-like weapon. The only difference is it might actually be a moon this time. The giant Death Star-like weapon then destroys a peaceful planet that is full of art and culture, except it's not Alderaan, it's the entire Hosnian Prime system. And of course, the only way to destroy said moon super laser weapon thing is by flying a starship into it and exploiting some engineering flaw inside. Why do this? Well, I mean, from a very cynical point of view, if it works, why try to change the formula? Also, I think Disney understood that a lot of Star Wars fans didn't really trust Disney at the outset, and so they try to create something familiar. And to be fair, I actually enjoyed The Force Awakens when it came out. I left the theater interested about what lay ahead, even if the story seemed a bit familiar. Now, the original ship that carried Luke Skywalker away from his Modesto, California was the Millennium Falcon. And together, Star Wars fans would watch in awe for the first time as Han Solo and Chewbacca hit the hyperdrive lever, causing the stars to start bleed into line, sending young Luke on his first adventure. And ever since then, that opening hyperdrive sequence is really a sign that our main hero is leaving the beginner area and entering the wider galaxy. In the prequels, we see Anakin leave Tatooine on that chromed out Naboo yacht. In the sequels, it's Rey on Jakku with the Falcon again. And then for KOTOR, we had the Ebon Hawk. For Jedi Fallen Order, it was the Stinger Mantis. For The Force Unleashed, it was the Rogue Shadow. And the feeling is pretty much the same for everyone who gets to enjoy hyperspace for the first time. It's a mixture of astonishment and joy. We see it on young Cassian Andor's face the first time when he's rescued by Marv, and later on as an older Andor who is rescued by Luthen Rael and his Fondor Hullcraft. And then in The Mandalorian, we of course have the Razor Crest, and finally in The Bad Batch, we have a ship called the Marauder. What is interesting about the two last ships I mentioned is they were both destroyed by the creators of their specific show, and that is something that rarely happens to what I like to call hub or home ships in Star Wars. I mean, the Millennium Falcon outlives Han Solo in canon and Chewbacca in Legends, the Rogue Shadow outlives the original Starkiller and serves as clone, and the Ebon Hawk would continue serving others when Revan was captured by the Sith Emperor. The Razor Crest would be destroyed by Moff Gideon, forcing Din Djarin to take on a much smaller Naboo starfighter custom built for him and Go-Gurt. It wasn't exactly a complete loss, but more of a transition. But the destruction of the Marauder somehow seems to indicate something very different. Now, the Marauder at a first glance is nothing special. It's just an Omicron-class shuttle from Cygnus-class workshops. All of their ships, including their famous Lambda-class shuttle, features this tri-wing design. That's how you recognize them. And this thing is basically a 30-meter-long transport designed to be efficient and practical for the Bad Batch. But one man's utilitarian starship is another girl's ticket off of Kamino. Specifically, it's Omega's ticket. Kamino might be the opposite of Tatooine, but its own extreme weather, along with the very cold nature of the Kaminoan people that lived there, probably made the idea of leaving Tipica City very enticing for young Omega. Like anyone her age, she was curious and interested to see what was out in the wider world, like young George Lucas, like young Luke Skywalker. And if you guys remember the first time Omega gets to sit on the Marauder and they leave Kamino and they hit the hyperdrive, do you remember that look in her face? That's really one of my favorite scenes of the first season. Like, they really do capture the wonder of what I imagine flying in space would be like. I mean, I've only been on a plane, but you know, when the first time I was on a plane, I hoped I was half as excited as Omega was. And it was at this point, this ship, the Marauder, became something much more to little Omega. Remember, she'd been stuck on Tipica City her whole entire life. Her only companion at the time was Nala Se, a high-level Kaminoan scientist. Nala Se might have protected her quite well, but Omega's relationship with Nala Se was always like that of a boss and an assistant. What she really wants, what any child wants, is, you know, to feel safe, to have a family, to have a home where she can be herself, be silly, unwind, and be protected. And it was only on the Marauder that Omega would make these connections, first with Hunter, then Wrecker, then with Echo, Tech, and eventually even Crosshair. The ship, especially after Wrecker built her a small nest in the rear gun turret, had become her new home. And very soon, Omega would feel completely relaxed here, in between their crazy adventures across the galaxy. The Marauder was every bit as important as the individual clones that made up the unit. And seriously, you cannot underestimate how important a home is to someone like Omega. Don't let her overly sweet and positive demeanor fool you. Beneath that bubbly surface is a darker and more tragic past of working in labs, living in austere environments with very little social interaction. And beneath that is the underlying fear that she will one day lose her autonomy again and perhaps become an experiment for the Empire to work on.
I don't want to end up an experiment in a tube.
That's not gonna happen.
If I'm as valuable as you say, Lama Su will keep sending bounty hunters after me.
And up until the last few episodes of The Bad Batch, the Marauder had been a dependable craft that could always whisk her away from danger. It wasn't just her home, but her escape from everything horrible. Now, I've noticed something in this show, in the trajectory of the show, that has me kind of worried. The first season of The Bad Batch focused quite a lot on the characters Hunter and Wrecker developing a bond with Omega, whereas the second season focused more on Tech and Echo developing a relationship to Omega. It's clear that Omega is the hub and at the root of most of the decisions made by the Bad Batch, which is working extremely hard to keep her safe. And when the Bad Batch arrive on the tropical island of Pabu, there's an excitement that this island might be the perfect place for them to settle down, but we find out that no matter how hard these clones try to adjust to civilian life, there's always going to be conflict chasing them. This is kind of the curse that they must all live with. And Pabu also seems to reject their presence. As a result, first we have a gigantic wave that threatens the island, followed by an Imperial invasion that once again targets Omega. There could be no rest for the Bad Batch. I think this was really designed to foreshadow the inevitable collapse of the Bad Batch or destruction of this unit. It shows us that Pabu, a stationary place, was never really a choice for them to hide. They need to stay on the run, on the Marauder. Now this show is definitely darker than most animated shows, and after Tech's death in the last season, we just don't know what else could happen to the squad. But the destruction of the Marauder by CX-2 during the Imperial invasion of Pabu, well, that to me is the death of another character. A very important character that is essential to the Bad Batch's survival. And so now, without their tropical retreat and without their home, the Bad Batch is extremely, extremely vulnerable. And on top of that, the team is now just back to 3. Echo is gone, helping start the clone revolution with Rex. So is just Wrecker, Crosser, and Hunter. I guess it's just inevitable that they would do this, strip away everything that the Bad Batch represented. Or perhaps like with Din Djarin's Razor Crest, the destruction of the Marauder is a sign that the Bad Batch are about to experience a very drastic change. For Din Djarin, the Razor Crest represented his old life, which was mainly driven by bounty hunting and the pursuit of credits. The Razor Crest even had specialized compartments for bounties frozen in carbonite. But bounty hunting is a morally great job, and that's what led him to capture Gogurt in the first place and commit his original sin. Din Djarin eventually abandoned bounty hunting because it's something unethical and also very dangerous. He sets a bad example for Gogurt and also puts him in danger. In the later seasons, he begins to focus on trying to take better care of the young boy. And after the little green guy rejects the teachings of Luke Skywalker, it's very clear that Din Djarin and Gogurt will continue being a family. And so for their new adventures, all they really need is a small N1 starfighter. There might not be much room on board for criminals frozen in carbonite, but that little tube of Gogurt definitely looks comfortable in that astromech slot. With the Marauder gone and destroyed, perhaps the clones can finally cut themselves off from the Empire they once served. They already modified their armor and their helmets. It only makes sense for them to also leave behind this ship that serves as their last connection to the life they once knew. But again, because the Marauder is also their home and also is Omega's home, I am worried about its destruction. It could have been a cornerstone of this family. Because without a home, without a safe place to rest and be safe, some families really do struggle. And ultimately, if we take a look at Star Wars lore, well, it doesn't look good for the Bad Batch at all. I mean, Palpatine is successful. He does manage to clone himself many times and even possesses one of those bodies in the future. How is Palpatine able to do that without Omega? And with just a few episodes left and Omega in custody, all the signs point towards the fact that something horrible might be happening very soon. Let's also not forget that Crosshair somehow made it back and reconciled with his brothers, bringing closure to another side arc. Another sign that things are about to end. Perhaps it's the Bad Batch, the original clones minus Echo and Tech, who will fade away with their Marauder. Hunter, Wrecker, and Crosshair never did belong anywhere. And perhaps with the Marauder gone now, their time is limited as well. So that's our video for today. I hope you enjoyed it. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification button down below so you don't miss out on the rest of our awesome content. As usual, my name is Alan, reminding you that my allegiance is to the Republic, to democracy. I'll see you next time.